and I am the SORNA Victim Coordinator. And today I'm here to follow my colleagues and discuss, just for a few minutes, trauma and the way forward. It's important for us to understand, as my colleagues have already shared, that trauma victims suffer does not always end when the police arrive. My police colleagues are often the first ones on the scene to assist and try to remove the individual from immediate danger. Once they get the physical safety of the survivor, the next level of trauma begins. Trauma for victims of sexual assault, dating, domestic violence, and stalking is often a lifetime of triggers. Disruption to their daily lives, suffering, distress, fear, and much, much more. The impact of trauma is potentially triggering and re-traumatizing. Exposure to cumulative and emotional and psychological wounding often interferes with the survivor's ability to heal. A trauma survivor who suffered from both physical and emotional abuse often suffers for years, sometimes for a lifetime. They blame themselves. If I hadn't, maybe I shouldn't have. I shouldn't have said that. For most survivors, physical wounds will heal. However, the emotional scars may continue for months and years ahead. Today, I would like to introduce you to some real survivors of trauma and sexual assault. And I would like to say to all of you, if you should need any support, the Office of Victim Advocate is here to support you in any way you need. And for any one of you who are here that need support, we're here for you. And so I would like to introduce to you our mediator for today, and that would be Lisa Ryan. Lisa?
Hi, everybody.
Oh, I didn't have it on. Excuse me.
Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay. I want to thank you all for being here for our survivor panel. The three women next to me are amazing individuals who are part of our Resilient Voices Speakers Bureau. I think they are best equipped to introduce themselves, so I'm going to start off by asking them to share with the audience your name and some information about yourself. Also some information regarding your victimization.
Thank you, Lisa and June and OVA for inviting us here today. My name is Beth Dougherty. I'm a research chemist. I'm a musician, an advocate for victims. I've been married for 22 years. My husband and I, he's a great guy, I'm not biased at all, but we love camping and canoeing and hiking all over the United States. And we've also recently started ballroom dancing, that journey together, and we are just in love with that. I'm also a survivor of rape and child sexual abuse. I first met my rapist when I started the 7th grade. He was my music teacher and my band director, and music was and still is my passion. It's all I ever wanted to do. It's all I could ever remember wanting to play and perform. I was just captivated. So this teacher was my idol, you know. He was this professional who knew so much more, and that's what I wanted to do. And I looked up to him, I idolized him. And his manipulations and grooming started almost immediately, but you know, I was only 13 years old, so I wasn't aware of this 2 years later. He nurtured my music, you know, helped me learn about musicianship and musicality, bought me music that I couldn't afford, gave me opportunities to play and have solos, even got my parents a deal on a professional flute, which I later found out was purchased and sold to me illegally. The sexual abuse started gradually. I don't remember the exact date that it escalated from verbal to physical, but I remember the incident like it was yesterday. You know, all these years later, I can still feel that degradation and that humiliation and the fear and the shame. And very quickly, the sexual abuse turned from molestation and touching to daily oral and vaginal rape, sometimes multiple times in a day. He would get me alone, pull me out of study halls, out of classes, and violate me in different parts of the school. And this man who raped me, I'm not going to call him a teacher, he's a rapist, sodomized and molested me for years in practice room, closets, bathrooms, even in my own home. There was no safe place. and he became friends with my family. Especially my father. They would hunt and golf together, and all of that excitement and happiness that I felt when I first met him turned into shame and fear, and he used every tactic in his arsenal to keep me quiet and isolated, threats, his authority, his force and manipulation, and I was terrified and distraught, but I tried to appear happy on the outside, bearing that brutality as deeply as I possibly could, until I couldn't take it anymore.
My name is Kate Rush. I am a mother of 2 girls who are now 21 and 14. I am a victims' rights advocate and an artist. Over the last 20 years, I've actively advocated for crime victims' rights, and I've been speaking about my experience to different venues for the past 25 years. In 1993, I was kidnapped, terrorized, robbed, and raped in my car by a man I had never seen before. I did report it. He was tried and acquitted of all charges. In 2004, he was caught again, and he was tried and found guilty, and he is currently serving a 20 to 40-year sentence in prison. I'm also a survivor of child sexual or physical and emotional abuse and domestic violence.
Hi, my name is Dr. Allison Whitehouse. I am a communication professor at Rider University. I'm a wife. I'm a mother of 2 children. I have a 9-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old, very, very active son. In my spare time, I sometimes end up at Sesame Place with my kids. I feel like most of my spare time is spent chasing children. I have a pretty full life, and I am also the victim of a serial date rapist. I was date raped in January of 2003. I was online dating in January of 2003. I met somebody through what is Match.com, and I met him and did all of the things that they tell you to do in terms of meeting someone. I met him in a public space. We went out and had drinks. We exchanged we exchanged information via email and phone prior to this. Unfortunately, I made one colossal mistake. I needed to use the restroom, and I left my drink unattended. And unfortunately, what happened was that this man put something in my drink, and I was drugged and date raped.
Thank you all. The next question is, what was the process like for you after being victimized? Did you come forward, and what supports were helpful and what was not?
It was extremely overwhelming. It took me years to tell anyone. During that time, I didn't even tell a friend. Out of fear for my younger sister's safety, I finally told my Girl Scout leader, whom I had known since 1st grade, and I trusted her, and I was fortunate that she believed and supported me, called a rape crisis hotline, and they guided her to help me to tell my parents, who had no idea this was going on. And my shocked and horrified and guilt-ridden parents immediately believed and supported me, but this was very difficult. And I also eventually reported it to the school district. It was always interesting to me because when I told a counselor there and then found out that she was a mandated reporter, which I just wasn't aware of that at the time. And we walked into the principal's office, and I didn't give a name, but they knew who it was. And then when I walked out of that office, my rapist was standing in the office shuffling papers, looking like a deer in headlights. He basically was terrified that I told someone, and he pulled me into a janitor's closet and said, you didn't tell anyone, did you? First he started to threaten, and then he started to beg, please just let me work this out with your dad. Don't tell anybody, don't do anything. Then eventually I was contacted by detectives from Allegheny County, and charges were formally filed. The supports that I had, I mean, my friends and family were incredible. My parents are real heroes. They were devastated and guilt-ridden. I'm sorry, I'm so emotional, but you know, we had to move out of our community. We had been getting death threats, and you know, I had even gotten beaten up by his supporters. We had to move. I felt like I was being exiled from my own home. My sister shared with me a memory that she had where I wasn't even aware of this, but I guess shortly after I told him this was going on, she walked in on my parents, and my mom was holding my father in her arms, and he was sobbing because this man who he trusted violated his daughter, and he didn't even know what was going on. So it was just devastating from the beginning to the end. I was assigned legal advocates from the Center for Victims of Violence and Crime, and all of you who are advocates, thank you, is hardly enough. I mean, they were with me from the beginning to the end, supporting me, you know, lightening things when it got too intense, you know, during the trial, pre-trial hearing, all of that. It was just an incredible service to have. And of course, all of the rape crisis centers. We have 2 in Allegheny County, and that was it was incredible to have those 2 services there. And also, I just want to say that the 2 detectives and the ADA in my case, you know, this was 30 years ago. You know, we didn't have Megan's on. We didn't have any of this. We didn't talk about trauma informed. But the first people that I actually gave details about my abuse to were 2 strangers, 2 detectives, you know, who sat there and were patient with me and sensitive and compassionate to me and my family, and it made all the difference in the world. And some of the things that weren't supportive were having to repeat my story on 5 different occasions. You know, I had to say what I went through, you know, twice, 2 different times to the detectives, again to the assistant DA, again at the pretrial hearing, again at the trial. It's completely overwhelming to have to go through that and be re-traumatized over and over again. And even things like the detectives had to take me through to all the places where the abuse and the rapes happened to take pictures for the trial exhibits. And I just felt like I was being traumatized over and over again, reliving this abuse. And one thing that has always stuck with me is this man, this rapist, who had this responsibility, had this tackle box full of keys, with keys to every room in the school, closets, you know, stock rooms, bathrooms, isolated places that he had access to, that he could take me and others to sexually violate us during school hours.
Usually when I tell my story, I always say that anything that could go wrong did go wrong in my case. When my rapist let me go, I went to my friend's house, and I think that the reality of what had happened to me set in, and I was about to get in the shower, and a friend of mine said, you know, we need to call the police. So the police came, and I was taken to the hospital in the back of a police car like a criminal. There was no special nurses that took rape kits at that time, and it was change of shifts, and the nurse made it very clear that she did not want to start a rape kit, and I was told that if I was home where I was supposed to be, that this wouldn't have happened to me, and that good girls aren't out at that hour. I was kidnapped at 11 o'clock at night. I don't think that that's an odd hour for a 20-year-old to be out at. My mom called the police department to ask, you know, I had given, this man gave me his name. He told me what his name was, and I was expecting a call from the police, and 3 days later my mom calls the police department, and she's told that they have priorities and they'll get to it when they get to it. And that's not acceptable. So I stood in the detective's department waiting and waiting and waiting until someone talked to me. I was not leaving until then. So the way that I was treated was not acceptable in any way, shape, or form. The supports that I had were my friends, and the people in victim witness, in our victim witness office, in our district attorney's office, were wonderful. I was connected with the Victim Assistance Center, and I don't know what I would have done without that counseling. But I reported it because I didn't want it to happen to anybody else, and I think that's why anybody reports it. I think that's it.
My reporting was complicated because I had been drugged, and I also had gone out for after-work drinks. So what ended up happening is I had about 2 beers, which even at my size, I weighed about 100 pounds at the time. 2 beers should not have left me incapacitated. I blacked out that evening. But the problem with date rape drugs is that you wake up and you're very confused. You lack the ability to make decisions in the moment. You are paralyzed in terms of being able to move. And when you wake up the next day, there are whole pieces of the evening that you just can't account for. And so as a victim, what that makes you feel like is an unreliable witness. So I really questioned. I couldn't tell you what happened. I knew what I had to drink. I knew that I intended, it was a work night, I intended to go to work the next day. I had driven in from work, so it wasn't like I was out partying or anything like that. However, again, I had 2 beers, which at the trial was something that the defense attorney did mention, that I had alcoholic beverages. And so I wasn't really clear what happened. I felt horrible. One of the other things that you may or may not know about date rape drugs is that in most cases, the after effect is that it mimics a hangover. You feel awful. You have a pounding headache. Many of the other women who he also victimized mentioned that they had stomach issues the next day. People were vomiting. You don't feel like you have a lot of wherewithal to make sense of what happened. And then you add to that the fact that you're missing whole pieces of the evening. You know what happened, but you can't account for it. One of the things that often happens to victims is we ask, why didn't you fight back? Well, I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. All of these things, when you're not aware of the impact of date rape drugs, which I was not in my mid-20s, I knew that they existed, but I didn't really have the full understanding of what that does to someone, really complicates reporting. So I went home. I decided not to report. I went to work the next day. I ultimately did go to my doctor, and I did have a medical exam to make sure that I was okay. So that's pretty much one of the few people that I reported to. I really, again, didn't know what happened. And to make matters a little bit more difficult, my rapist had a pattern. And what he would do is he would call you afterwards. And he would try to convince you that you went on a normal date. And what ended up happening is that most women didn't report. In fact, a number of women actually saw him afterwards, which made it even more difficult for a jury and a prosecutor to get a conviction. I waited 4 years. And what ended up happening one night is I was sitting and watching television, and there was a newscast where they described my rapist. And my husband was sitting next to me at the time, and he said, we were married maybe a year at the time, and he said, that sounds an awful lot like what happened to you. And I looked up in just enough time to see his picture flash across the screen. Now, it's a Thursday night, and it's 2006, so it wasn't like I could just pick up my phone and Google him to see whether or not I had actually seen what I thought I saw. The next day, I did decide to call and to report what happened, because until this moment, it never occurred to me that anyone else had gone through what happened to me. I thought that I went on a date with a doctor. I thought that he was a legitimate, credible person in society, and I really worried about accusing him of rape, especially when I couldn't put all the facts together. I didn't have all the pieces. So instead what I did is I blamed myself and I internalized it. The next day I called a victims advocacy group. I left my name, I explained why I was calling, and I waited all day. And I will always remember this because it was a Friday afternoon, and I waited, and I waited. I had left my phone number and I thought someone would call me back. No one ever did. So I got online and I found the district attorney who was trying the case. His name was Joe Kahn, if some of you are familiar with him. He was trying a second case against my rapist. The first had 3 victims that came forward, accusing the man of nearly identical acts of drugging and raping, and unfortunately he was acquitted of all charges. Joe Kahn was putting together a second case against this individual, and he had a couple women who were willing to testify, and I called and told him that I was a victim as well. And it's a Friday afternoon, probably around 5 o'clock, and he says to me, I have to stop you. You can't share with me your story. You need to call the Philadelphia office of the FBI. Now, I don't know about you, but the FBI is something that I think of like as a television show. I never think of somebody like me calling the FBI. And I remember saying to Joe, well, wait, you want me to call the FBI? And well, who do I talk to? And he gives me this agent's name. And I called him around 5 o'clock. And he said to me, you know, Allison, we'll make an appointment for you on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. You can come in and share with us your story. And so I had to wait the whole weekend before going into the Philadelphia office of the FBI on Monday morning to share my story with 2 male FBI agents who were, I will tell you, very nice men, listened to my story. And at the end, I remember saying to them, I'm not sure if I'm accusing the right person. And they looked at me and said, oh, we have files on him. And they showed me his picture, and I was able to confirm, oh yes, this is the right person. But from a victim standpoint, my reporting was a very surreal experience, not something that I think you expect, and probably not typical of the type of experience that most people have when they report. I did delay reporting, and I think one of the things to know in here, or at least as part of this conversation, is that many people do delay reporting for a variety of reasons. It doesn't necessarily mean the story is invalid. It just means that for whatever reason, we waited to share what happened to us.
If you went through the court process, please explain the impacts this has had on you. How has this impacted your journey?
Well, after I reported, the preliminary hearing took place about 3 months later after I talked with the detectives, and that was in my junior year of high school, and then the trial was set for 5 months later, which is actually pretty incredible considering, you know, from the time that I talked to the detectives to the trial, it was about 9 months, which seems like an eternity, but, you know, we didn't have sex offender court, you know, back then, so it's pretty incredible that they were able to get that burden of proof and get that trial date set. But even still, you know, it was a long time to wait, and, you know, we weren't, even after the trial date was set, they had said, well, it may start, you know, on this date next Monday, and they weren't sure, you know, they can't tell you for sure, I get that, but in between, my grandfather had died, and, you know, we had to leave his wake to go start this 2-week trial that I was going to be testifying in. And in addition, before that, you know, he was released on $150,000 bail, and, you know, my friends would be calling me saying, you know, don't go down on Main Street, his Jeep's on the, you know, on the main street, you don't want to run into him, and this added more agony, you know, to that time. After promising that there would be no investigation if my teacher resigned quietly, the superintendent of the school wrote him a glowing recommendation letter so that he could obtain a teaching job at a junior high school in Florida, where he stayed for a year teaching until his extradition. And that's horrifying to me too, being as the statistics indicate that an average sex offender abuses about 300 people in their lifetime. And I remember the detective saying that they could have lined up victims from Pennsylvania to Florida, but a lot of the statute of limitations had expired. So they weren't even able to do that. There was a woman that called, said that she had been raped by him while he was a student teacher 12 years prior, but the limitations had expired. For this trial, 4 other girls had come forward because he had molested them. I was the only one that had rape and involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, among other charges. And it was extremely isolating to, I felt just alone and hopeless a lot of the time. My parents and my friends were sequestered. They weren't allowed to be in the courtroom with me because they were also testifying to things, and it felt a lot of times like he had all the rights and I had no rights. I didn't have any support, other than that one advocate, that was there in the courtroom with me, and of course the defense made false accusations and disparaging remarks against me that still haunt me to this day. I mean, it's horrible what they say. And I was also fortunate that my judge allowed my therapist at the time to testify as an expert witness, which is not always allowed. She was able to talk about my PTSD, the nightmares that I was having, the loss of sleep, all the after effects of what had happened. And we've made enormous strides. However, society still wonders, well, what did they do or not do? And jurors aren't immune to that. So it's good to have these experts be able to say, this is what the normal, this is a normal reaction. People don't always come forward right away. It's actually more normal to not report immediately. Just having her be able to do that was a huge, it could have, the verdict could have gone a different way. And the jury did deliberate for 10 hours. And came back with a guilty verdict, and he was convicted of 42 counts, which included rape and involuntary deviant sexual intercourse and corruption of minors. I passed out in the back of the courtroom after this happened. That stress and anxiety of the last 5 years was just overwhelming. It was just too much. It was unbearable for me to handle. This man who had stolen so much of my life to that point, it just didn't feel real, and I was fortunate that he received that guilty verdict, because that doesn't always happen either. A month later, during the sentencing, the judge, basically said that he was a Dr. Jekyll, and it was just absolutely horrendous that he had betrayed the communities, the commonwealths, the family, especially being a teacher, supposed to, take care of and protect the kids, and he was sentenced to 30 to 70 years in prison. And then I was left to pick up the pieces of my life, and there have been permanent losses, things that can never be fixed. It's like tearing up a photo of yourself and then losing some of those pieces and trying to tape them back together. It's devastating. And I continued to get death threats and hate mail from his supporters. It was a very public trial in the media. People were calling into talk shows, calling me a slut and a whore, acting like I wanted to be raped, acting like I wanted to, go through this very public event. I just wanted to be a kid. I wanted to play my flute, So, yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
So, I went through the court system twice, and both times were uniquely horrifying. My first time was for my trial. 6 months before my rape, I had lost my best friend. She died during a high-speed police chase. The person that they were chasing ran into her, and I was absolutely devastated. The reason that that's important is because of the defense that my rapist used. When I went to trial, I dressed in business attire. I thought I was dressing to go to court. When I arrived in the courthouse, I was told that I needed to go home and change into more victim-like clothing. And I didn't really understand why they were saying that, because really, what does a victim look like? Then I sat through jury selection, and listened to the public defender say that due to the death of my best friend that I turned to drugs and prostitution to forget about her. So I was a prostitute and I sold myself for drugs to this known drug dealer, which the district attorney couldn't bring that fact up. There were a couple things that happened during that trial, but the gist of it is because I was dressing in victim-like clothing, my credibility was called into question, and my rapist was acquitted of all charges. So, in November of 2003, I had a nervous breakdown. I was putting myself through college. I had a young daughter. There were some things going on with her. As I was going to work one day, I went to get my coffee at the Turkey Hill around the corner from my house, and when I went in, I got my coffee. I held the door open for someone, and when I got in my car, I realized that I had held my door open for my rapist. And he came out to my car, and he got down and he looked at me, and he followed me for a while. I finally lost him. I went to work. It took me about 3 hours to calm down at work. My supervisor knew what happened. I was a manager at the Bonton, and I was the manager on duty that night. So I got myself together. On my lunch hour, I got called into the office and was written up for unprofessional conduct. There were a couple of times I saw my rapist walking through my neighborhood, and because I didn't fully deal with what had happened to me, seeing him put me in a tailspin, and I had a nervous breakdown. So I had just started to see somebody that specialized in trauma, and I remember it was January 7th, my neighbor worked for the Department of Corrections, and he told me that my rapist was brought in over the weekend for raping someone else. And, sorry. So, I was on my way to the district attorney's office anyway for a meeting, and while I was there, I saw her, and the police talked to me and asked me, because he had given her his name too, he talked to me because they didn't believe that. Why would a rapist give someone the name? And that detective was told by a detective that handled my case that we didn't believe her either, so you need to talk to her. Her trial was in July of 2004, and going through hers, I didn't go to the trial. I went to closing arguments, and it was at that time that I had a chance to meet her and find out, how similar our experiences were. We were not allowed to sit next to each other for the verdict, which made no sense, but she told me that because I didn't get a verdict that she would share hers with me. And he was found guilty. He was found guilty of everything except for robbery. During that, it was the assessment and the sentencing process which were more difficult, which I believe that's the next question, so.
My rapist went through 3 separate, highly publicized trials. The first were in Philadelphia, the first 2, and the third trial was in Idaho. Prior to his first trial, he fled bail and he went to Idaho and he drugged and raped another woman out there. So prior to my trial, they found this out. They were not actually able to use that as part of the trial, but we knew afterwards that after my trial in 2007 that he would be facing charges in Idaho as well. Ultimately, what happened in my case is that I saw that news segment that I shared with you a few minutes ago in 2006, which prompted my visit to the FBI in the fall of 2006. I think it was pretty late fall, like October, November timeframe. By the day after Christmas in 2006, so December 26th, I was literally in a preliminary hearing. And a preliminary hearing determined that my case was strong enough to move forward to trial. Ultimately, I am under the impression there were about 24 women whose cases were potentially considered as part of the second trial. The district attorney selected cases. I'm not sure entirely on what basis, but mine was selected. So I testified along with 7 other women who I understand share nearly similar accounts of what happened to them, of going out on a date, or even just, I think one of the women didn't actually date him, but met him in her apartment building and went out for a drink with him, and somewhere in the middle of the evening losing consciousness and unfortunately having a very similar experience. 12 jurors heard what happened to the 7 of us over a fairly long and highly publicized trial, at least it seemed long to me. I was not able to attend any of the trial with the exception of my piece and closing arguments. One of the first people that I disclosed to was actually my husband. So he testified at the trial, and one of the strange things to me was that we were told that in case of a mistrial, we shouldn't talk to each other about what we said in court, which is a really odd thing to go home and be really upset about something and then not really be allowed to talk to your spouse about what happened. And so it was, I will say, I think many of the other 2 panelists have already shared that it was a really difficult experience. My time frame, similar to yours, was fairly tight. We moved from preliminary hearing in December to testimony the following spring, and then fortunately for me, by the following fall, he was sentenced. Ultimately, a jury heard what happened, and they acquitted him of all charges of rape. They were hung on 1 count, but they did decide to convict him of 2 counts of sexual assault, which, if you're familiar with the criminal justice system in the state of Pennsylvania, that carries with it a maximum of 10 years in prison. Or it could be a pretty minimal sentence like community service. So from the time the trial ended in spring until sentencing, I was pretty nervous that he would basically be walking the street. Fortunately, the judge, after hearing all of the testimony, found that he was not only a sexually violent predator, but he sentenced him to the maximum allowed by law, and he's currently serving 21 years in the state penitentiary in Pennsylvania, and he will hopefully be moving to Idaho after that.
How has the process going through the sentencing impacted you? If you have gone through a sexually violent predator hearing or the parole process, please share as well.
Well, I mean, the sexual violence that I endured at the hands of this rapist teacher, it's permeated my life in every way imaginable, and I had no idea how profound the effects or how far-reaching and long-term the consequences would be. You know, after the trial, I tried to, be normal, thinking about college and going and taking SATs and college tours while, keeping up with my other commitments and, dealing with all of the, the interviews and the trials and everything that goes along with that. So I moved forward with my life, but my trust had been shattered. And what I found that I just tried to push it all down, push it all away, and I found that doesn't work. It usually comes out. So I went to college and drank heavily, and by my sophomore year, I attempted suicide, and I was fortunate that my roommates found me and took me to the ER and saved my life. I felt hopeless and alone. I have gone through the parole process. In 2015, I got my first letter at the beginning of December, and even though I had waited for this time, I knew it was coming. When it actually got there, it was pretty dramatic. It was horrific, and thankfully I had OVA to help me through and process all this. They've been helping me over the last 25 years. I'm able to pick up the phone and say, what's the status? What's going on? What do I need to know? In fact, they were able to bring me a lot of comfort just by knowing that he wasn't able to be up for parole until a year before his minimum, which helped me to be able to move on and heal with my life because I knew I was safe. I knew he was in prison. But when this first letter came, it all came just rushing back, all the violation and the anxiety and wondering, should I provide testimony? My first question was, oh my gosh, is he going to know? Is it confidential? Am I going to end up, he's going to get out and, he's going to know that I testified again? And I was informed that it was indeed confidential, which is so important for victims to understand that, they're safe and they can come forward. So my husband and I did decide to give in-person testimony after it ruined our Christmas, and we went over and over and over again. I will say, although there was a lot of anxiety, that it was an incredibly cathartic experience for me, and I'm grateful that we chose to do it, because it's interesting when I look back, I always thought that I had given an impact statement. We didn't have the victims' rights back that many years ago, and when I look back now, I'm like, wow, actually all I did was answer questions about the rapes that were done to me. I didn't give impact at all. I wasn't even aware of the impact until much into adulthood. So being able to go and testify in person for over 45 minutes and tell the impact this had on my life, just major, profound impacts on my life, it was incredible. And my husband also got to talk about how this man who he's never even met has affected him and affected our marriage and affected our families. So I appreciate being able to do that. And then we waited 4 agonizing weeks for the results and found out that they were denying him parole. And then it happened again. Well, it was supposed to be, he wasn't supposed to be allowed to apply again for, I guess, 3 years. But then I was told that he still had a right to apply again in a year, which very confused me. I was like, but why even have this parole board say these things if he still can do this? And then I was anxious about, am I gonna have to go through this again in 6 months? And it ended up being another year and a half, and went through it again. This time they also said that he was denied parole, and said that he hadn't taken responsibility for his actions. He didn't show remorse. He was a danger to society. Then this past December, I got the next letter, and each time after the in-person, we just wrote letters because it was just too much to deal with the in-person again. And we waited 8 weeks this time. And of course, I was like, oh my gosh, it's taking longer. What's wrong? What's going on? Oh my gosh, this is going to be it. And I found out, actually last week, that he's being released on parole. And I have to say, it's very raw. That's why I'm so emotional today. It's just, it's very anxiety producing. For the many years after the trial, I stayed under the radar. I tried to hide. I didn't have I had an unlisted number. I didn't give information out. And then as I started to heal, I was like, I don't need to hide anymore. And I started sharing my story so that other survivors could, get support and know they weren't alone. And now here I am, like 34 years later, thinking, oh my gosh, did I screw up? We're having discussions about, should we have security systems installed? How many cameras do we need? How are we going to afford it? And then I think, we're fortunate that we can, but what about people that can't? What about people that are afraid and they can't afford to put a $10,000 security system in their home? We're worrying about talking to the police. When do we do that? What's going to happen? How am I going to talk to the parole officer? Is he going to be trauma informed? Is he going to keep my confidentiality? Is he going to think I'm crazy and act like I'm being overreactive because, this man's 70 now, no big deal? And these questions are all unanswered. And I don't know if he's been... I find it hard to believe that in a year and a half it changed so drastically and now all of a sudden he's okay. And I'm not criticizing the parole board at all. I know their job is difficult and they're dealing with a lot of people, but that doesn't take the impact that it's had on me and my family away.
So I discovered I didn't have any kind of knowledge of Megan's Law because it wasn't in existence in 1994, but I found out that the process after the conviction that my rapist, her rapist, was going to have an assessment done to determine if he was a sexually violent predator, which I already knew that he was. But I also found that they would not be looking at my case because he was acquitted. But I started asking questions like, well, what other information do they look at? Because if you're looking at a juvenile record, which is supposed to be sealed, and you're looking at all of the other activities that, you know, he's been involved in, which there was many, my case was so similar to hers that I did not accept that answer. So I called Office of the Victim Advocate and asked to be put in touch with somebody at the Sexual Offender Assessment Board and pled my case. And I was put in touch with an investigator, and she came and met with me, and I was told up front, this is for information gathering purposes only. Your name will not be brought into my investigation. And I believed her. It was at that time that I found out that he was already a sex offender. He had offended as a juvenile, and he had a record a mile long, which didn't surprise me. So in October of 2004, we went to the sentencing, and I went with my friends who had been with me the night I was raped, and the other girl and her family were there, and it was kind of a packed house because everybody that worked in the DA's office wanted to see this guy go to jail because he was acquitted for what he did to me. So it was kind of like everybody wanted to see him put away. So the first thing the investigator says when she gets on the stand is, I could not ignore Miss Rush's rape. I had to look at it because the similarities were there. It was too similar. And at that point, the judge stopped the proceedings and ordered a new assessment. And I sat there and listened to the judge say that for the purposes of this new assessment, Miss Rush's rape never happened. And just because he got acquitted doesn't mean that it didn't happen. So they did another assessment. I was taken out of that courtroom by the police. I was questioned by the judge and the police. And then I was taken into a room by two ADAs, both who knew me because my husband worked in the district attorney's office. So these people knew me personally. They knew I was part of the Victims' Rights Coalition. They knew that I was waiting there to talk to the ADA about what had happened, the one that was actually in charge of the case. And I was asked, who the hell do you think you are? Why would you sabotage this case? You have no right to be here. This isn't about you. And then I was escorted by sheriffs out of the courthouse. Like I did something wrong. Sorry, I have leaky eyes right now. I thought I wasn't going to, but I just can't help it, sorry. So, this isn't stuff I normally talk about, so. They did another assessment, and he was found to be a sexually violent predator, and he was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison, and he comes up for parole in January of 2024. So hopefully I will be able to keep him in there until his full sentence. And I think that was it.
While I didn't get the rape conviction that I was hoping for, I did get a conviction for sexual assault, so that gave me the right to, at the time in 2007, give a victim impact statement. And I gave a victim impact statement to the court. And I'll tell you that one of the things that occurred to me about giving a victim impact statement is that you have to be coherent enough to tell your story, to a courtroom, while at the same time looking sad, right? Because that's apparently what the expectation of someone who's a victim is that we're going to weep and cry. And apparently I looked sad, but I was coherent enough to tell my story. And then when you give that impact statement, you have to talk about how that crime really impacted your life. And that's the purpose of it. And that's like the moment at which I felt like you're supposed to fall apart. Like you've been keeping it together, you've been telling your story, and now you have to talk about just how did this impact your life. And it had so many impacts, it really did, that was a very difficult thing to say. The other difficult thing is, as already mentioned here, when your rapist comes up for parole. The first time my rapist came up for parole, even though I was at one point in time registered with the Office of Victim Advocates, when I first went to trial, right after the trial they registered me, somehow I had gotten expunged. And so nobody ever contacted me the first time he came up for parole. Fortunately, he was denied parole, but I had no idea that that happened. It happened, I guess, about 3 years ago, right after Me Too. I guess maybe it's a little more than that now. That I started to Google him just because I was interested in what was going on with the case, and I happened to run across an article that indicated that he was up for parole. So I contacted the former assistant district attorney who had tried my case and said, did you know he was up for parole? And I didn't get any kind of notification. So he actually went and started to contact some of the people who could make the statement as part of the parole process. And we found that there were 3 of us that could make a statement. So at the end, he was given 2 convictions for sexual assault, and the other count where they were hung on a count of rape, they decided not to retry the case, and instead he pled no contest in another victim's case. So there were actually 3 of us that had the right to contest, or I guess to voice our opinions. We all contested, but to contest his parole. And only one of us had actually been notified. So I actually took it upon myself to get in touch with some of the other victims, including those who didn't have the right to voice their opinion as part of the parole process. To give you some indication, my rapist kept a running list for about a 2.5-year period of the women that he had sex with by first name and date. He had 68 names on that list, and they know that there were women before that list was started and after that it was seized in a raid of his apartment. So I don't know how many women he actually raped, but my guess is that there's quite a significant number of women. Not all of those women were able to testify in court, but some of them did actually come to the parole hearing. Some of those women came, they gave their voices, some of them added to a letter that I put together for the parole board. It was really amazing to see how many people were still impacted so many years later. And I have to say that it was very moving to hear a lot of their stories. But I want to make sure I get to pass this back to you.
Prior to and after your victimization, were you familiar with Megan's Law or sexually violent predator laws? Was this information explained to you at the time, or did you have to research it? Was there anything that surprised you? And do these laws make you feel safer, or do you notice any flaws in protecting victims from these offenders?
Well, like I said, the trial was 34 years ago, so Megan's Law and sexually violent predator assessments didn't happen. If they had, I would have willingly participated and provided impact statements or whatever I needed to do. I have researched it since then, especially considering I found out that he was going to be released on parole. And quite frankly, I had to have it explained to me as well because I thought I was missing something. Yes, I was surprised at the lack of protection for victims. I mean, it's really just a notification act, and as I saw this morning, no wonder I'm confused because the laws keep changing and, it seems like nobody knows what's really going on. I've been told that I'll have to register for the state police because he even though he is a sexually violent predator, I mean, he checked all the boxes. I mean, I'm not a psychotherapist, but I know what I see, and I know how many people have disclosed to me since that happened, I had girls, even during the trial, coming up to me saying, yes, he raped me too, but I just can't come forward. You know, years later, as I've been speaking, I don't say his name, but people know, and they say, yeah, I had an abortion. There was, you know, because he got me pregnant, or, you know, they're just, I can't even keep track of how many girls. So yes, he was a sexually violent predator. He is. I'm thankful that I had the foresight to request conditions when I wrote my parole letter, when I gave my in-person testimony, you know, and I don't think Megan's Law would have provided me with any of that. And so then I again wonder, like, would I have been safe? You know, am I safe now? I'm not even sure. So yeah, the laws don't really make me feel safer, because I don't think there's really anything that truly protects us. You know, I wonder about his computer usage. Is anybody monitoring that? You know, now he's gonna be able to Google me. You know, he's gonna know, like, he can look up where I live. He can look up what I'm involved in. I have a band, I'm playing a symphony. You know, it's all online. And I wonder, is he vengeful enough to show up? You know, does he care if he breaks parole? Like, I don't know what's gonna happen. You know, the people that beat me up before, are they gonna start harassing me again? I don't have the answers to these questions. And, you know, it's just, it's quite disturbing. And again, it's very raw right now, and I'm trying to figure it out.
Like I stated before, Megan's Law wasn't in existence in 1993. In 2004, nothing was explained to me because I wasn't a victim of that particular crime. So that's why I'm a big one for doing my own research and knowing what's going on. I want to know what to expect and what's coming. So that's why I started asking questions, and I wanted to know if my case was going to be looked at and why not. And that's why I pushed and I advocated for myself, because I thought it was important. Nothing really surprises me. I don't have an answer for that one. Sorry. Sometimes you just have to break the tension with a little humor.
Yeah.
Anyway, the laws don't really make me feel safer, because it's only for the people who have been caught. I think it's a false sense of security from a victim standpoint. And as a parent, like, I want to know, I know where all the sex offenders live around me, and that's great to know, but there's probably a whole bunch more that are offenders that haven't been caught yet. So I really think that there's pros and cons to it, like with anything else, but that's just my personal opinion.
So Megan's Law, to me, originally, I equate it with child sex offenders. I honestly didn't, until this came up for me, equate it with adults. I've always thought it only related to kids. I'm not entirely certain what was explained to me in 2007. I know that he was deemed a sexually violent predator. I know it was explained to me that it was a separate hearing. A lot of that, I think, as a victim and somebody, you know, who can now say that I was impacted by trauma, probably had a hard time processing and remembering a lot of what was said. I am happy that he was deemed a sexually violent predator. What was the second half of the question? I'm sorry. Do I feel safer under Megan's Law?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh.
Or did you notice flaws?
Oh, okay, thank you. Sorry. Spotty brain today. I don't necessarily feel safer under Megan's Law. I am happy that we have laws. I think that it's important that we have the protections in place. But the man who victimized me, my rapist, was not only a predator, but he was a con artist. The news media categorized him by sharing that he actually had props of various professions that he said he was. He was actually a dropout nursing school student, but he actually managed to parade through the halls of Hahnemann Hospital in Philadelphia as though he was a doctor. He managed to get somebody to print him an ID badge so that he could swipe in as a doctor. He wore scrubs and walked through the halls. He checked patients' medical records. He went into the cadaver lab. This is not somebody that I think is going to happily adhere to Megan's Law. I think that a con artist is a con artist and that he is most likely going to manipulate the system, whether it's a prison system or whether it's an external system. So I really fear for the day that he is released from prison. I have 2 small children. I shared that with you earlier. I am really worried about what would happen if he is released. Not only to me, but would he show up at my children's schools? Not to say that he is a child sex offender, but would he take vengeance in some way on me because I do have a conviction? And I think that as victims, that is always a lingering concern in the back of our minds, is what is going to happen to us and to those that we love if this person who has been deemed a predator and has a number of predatory convictions and maybe even some that he should have been convicted of against him, what is he going to do to us if and when he's released?
Thank you. I am going to combine the next 2 just so that, because I feel they're both very important for you to end with. Provide some ways that you think survivors should be heard throughout the criminal justice process, specifically when it comes to changes in laws for Megan's Law registrations and sexually violent predator notifications, and provide us some information on where you are today, first full circle, and all the advocacy efforts that you all have. I know that's a lot. I'll repeat it.
Well, I feel like we've made so many strides and successes and forward progress, and I appreciate that. On our legislation, on victim services, awareness, compensation, Megan's Law, all these wonderful things. We have the Office of the Victim Advocate, which we didn't have when I went through my trial, and again, they've been so helpful. Even just having this here today, I've learned so much. And they always make sure that we're not getting lost in that legislative process, which is comforting to me and important. The Crime Victims Act, again, didn't have that. Wasn't able to do impact statements back then. But unfortunately, we don't have a balanced system. There is no enforcement of victims' rights, which I know everybody here knows. I mean, victims are always walking into these courthouses, with the offenders having constitutional rights, and we have nothing to stand on when our rights are being violated. So hopefully Marcy's Law will get at it as an addendum, and we will actually have some constitutional amendment that give us a right to motion the court when our rights have been violated. And it doesn't take anything away from the defendants. It just puts us in equal footing, which is so important. And I really feel that all laws, all legislation that's being made, especially for victims and sexual assault victims and all victims, people should always be seeking our voices. Decisions shouldn't be made in a vacuum. This affects us. The victims are the ones that have experienced these horrendous crimes. I feel like these 2 wonderful souls up here on stage with me today. I mean, the impact that's had on themselves, on their lives, on their families, on their communities. I mean, we always need to be continually aware of what these laws are doing and the impact that it has on us, and then trying to reduce those traumatic reverberations that victims go through. It just keeps reverberating over and over again. So I just hope that we all just continue to be aware of that as we're going forward. And I also thank you for what you are doing. So what am I doing? And like I said, I'm a wife, I'm a sister, I'm an advocate, I'm all these different things. I'm still a musician. I'm not just a statistic. Rape and sexual abuse are what happened to me, what were done to me. They're not who I am. They don't define me. And after a lifetime of struggle and therapy and a lot of healing, I still have my music, despite that he could have destroyed that. And now I'm able to give back. I'm honored to be part of the Resilient Voices. I've been a part of this group since 2007. I've served on Pittsburgh Action Against Rape's board of directors. I've served as their board chair. I've been involved with PCAR and the Vision of Hope Council. I've testified on legislative hearings. I've been a rape counselor on a hotline. I had a lot of difficulty. The abuse has affected my physical health and well-being. I was terrified of healthcare providers and doctors. I had a lot of difficulty with this. I couldn't imagine undressing for an exam, or disclosing my abuse when I was feeling vulnerable, or talking to a healthcare provider about what had happened to me, and they didn't really get that link. It just was missing. And after working through my PTSD and trauma, I started my own organization called the Trust Project in 2007, and I've been advocating for victims and training medical and healthcare professionals and students about the impacts of trauma and being trauma-informed and having trauma-informed healthcare. And I've been speaking nationally. I've reached over 3,000 people now, medical professionals, since 2007, and I'm really proud of that because it's taken a lot of work, and I hope it helps. And I'm also really proud to be and honored to be a part of HEAL PA, making trauma, PA a trauma-informed state, which is so important. So I'm glad to be a part of that. And I would just like to say that the symphony that I currently play flute in, a couple years ago, pre-COVID, we started having these outreach concerts for kids. So they would come to our rehearsal and they would sit there and watch us. And we had the 6th grade music class they came in, and when I walked into rehearsal, it really struck me how young they looked. They were all so little and impressionable. They were all wide-eyed and excited, this continuous chatter talking about their musical instruments and what they want to do, and they looked at us as gods, wishing that they could play like us, And there was one little girl that sat there with her jaw dropped the whole time. She never blinked. And as I watched them smiling, I started to cry because I realized that they were probably just a year younger than I was when I started being violated by a teacher. I was that little girl in the front row, and we, the adults on the stage, had a responsibility. We were there to share our joy of music with them, to inspire them, to motivate them and nurture them. And sometimes I do struggle with sharing my story publicly, but I also know in my heart that the only way to bring about change is to shine light into those cracks, as Leonard Cohen put it. And I'm here today for those young people and for all those victims and people that are struggling right now. They deserve to be protected and heard and nurtured. And I just want to again thank my 2 panelists. Thank you for sharing your heartbreaking stories. Thank you, OVA, for inviting me, and thank all of you for being here to hear what victims are experiencing in the Commonwealth and trying to make it different.
Okay, you're a tough act to follow there, Beth.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, so the first question, let's see. Ways survivors should be heard through the criminal justice process. I believe that survivors should have a voice in the criminal justice system, as it's what the crime is affecting them, not the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is officially the victim, but the real victims are the ones that are being affected. So I think that their voice deserves to be heard and not minimized, as I often feel like I was not being heard. I didn't have a chance to give a victim impact statement in my case, obviously, or the subsequent case, but my daughter was raped, and I had a chance to write a victim impact statement as a parent, but she wasn't required to attend the sentencing, so I also helped her write hers and read hers to the judge. And that was hard for me for so many reasons, because it was my baby, but it was also, I felt like I was being heard, and I felt like her voice was being heard, and I felt that the sentence reflected that. And as far as laws being passed, I know Beth and I have testified before the judiciary for, I don't remember, the specific bill was for expert testimony in rape cases, and I really think that that's the most important part for the judiciary to hear when they're hearing something that's put in front of them. Like, it's important to hear the voices of victims who it's affected, because you can make a more informed decision when you hear how it really affects people. It's not as abstract if you can hear how it affects people instead of reading about a written statement or something. I just think it's more effective. So, full circle. So this year on August 20th, it'll be 28 years since my rape. I have complex PTSD. And right now, I'm actively working on addressing issues with my psychologist. We're starting an intense 12-week therapy session with a workbook and everything, and I'm super excited. Hopefully it'll work. I've always spoken candidly about my experience and advocated for others. I did go to college. I put myself through college in my 30s for criminal justice and psychology with a minor in art, which I'm not using. Go figure. Well, that's not true. I'm using part of it. In 2015, my younger brother and my father passed away a month apart from each other, and I took a break from speaking. Some of it voluntarily, and some of it people told me that I wasn't allowed to speak because I needed to recover. I'm looking at Lisa just because she's from OVA, and there was other agencies that told me the same thing, like, you need to take a break. Because it is draining, and it takes a lot out of you, and I really am appreciative to the people that told me I needed to step back, because I don't think I could have kept going the way I was. Like, I was in I kind of am still in self-preservation mode a lot. During that time, I started using I was always artsy-fartsy, and when I was 20, I was taking a year off from school. Sorry, this always gets me. I was taking a year off before I started art school. And because what happened to me, I didn't get to do that. So a couple years ago, I had an opportunity to run a program for our local arts agency with teenagers called Teen Art House, and it was all teenagers who had emotional issues and things, and it was just such a good fit. And I started doing that program, and then just dove right in doing private lessons and teaching group art projects. And then I started showing my work, and my artwork really has honestly saved my life. And now I have a line of jewelry and a line of cards, and they're carried in stores, and it's like super exciting. So I feel like I have truly come full circle, because I'm doing what that 20-year-old girl wanted to do. So, sorry, but I still love speaking, and I will do it because it's important, and it is a part of me. I don't think I can give up, but art is what has saved my life. So that's where I am now.
Can I add that the beautiful jewelry she's wearing, she made? Okay, these two are a tough act to follow. They've already said most of what I had thought about saying. No, that's okay. It saves me the opportunity to basically say that, as mentioned, I think that victims' voices need to be heard within the system. I think that there needs to be more advocacy work related to victims' rights. I know that as a person who's gone through the system, I always felt like in some ways the criminal had more rights than I did. And there were times where I had to stop and think to myself, like, oh, wait a minute, where was the system when I was being, when my rights were taken, when I didn't have the freedom to choose what I wanted to do with my body? I feel like that there are still a lot of opportunities where legislatively you could make a difference for victims' rights and victims' voices within the system. In terms of my advocacy efforts, I have, this is actually my first opportunity to speak on behalf of the Office of Victim Advocates, so thank you very much for being my first audience here. But I have done some speaking on college campuses. I'm a college professor, and it's really important to me to talk to students. I feel that unfortunately, college campuses are a target for predators, particularly those using drugs, and also alcohol is a trigger for sexual assaults and rapes on college campuses. I have spoken to groups. I would like to continue to do that. I launched a website this year. If anyone is interested, is icameforward.com, and you can find out more about my speaking and advocacy there. My work in the college and university system looks at gender studies and gender as it relates to communication. So I have always looked at things. My dissertation, when I got my PhD, was related to female business owners. Currently, I'm working on a book where I am talking with women who went through the same experience that I have gone through. I am actually putting together a book project with, right now, I believe I have 6 women who had the same experience with the serial rapist that I had. And I have more who are also willing to share their stories, and I'm putting them together as a collection. Additionally, I have written about my experience. My most recent piece was when Cosby was released from jail. I wrote an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer. So I do continue to advocate for victims and for victims' rights. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it. I think everyone in the audience learned a lot from all of you today, and how we do our jobs. And I can't say enough about our Resilient Voices speakers. So one more clap for them.
Yeah, thank you so much.